Midnight struck across Europe with a mixture of celebration and tension that nobody could have predicted. In Allied airfields scattered throughout Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, exhausted pilots lifted whatever drinks they could find. These men had survived months of brutal aerial combat. They had watched the German war machine slowly retreat from Normandy through the bitter winter months. Tonight felt different. Tonight felt like hope. Ground crews joined the celebrations with voices hoarse from shouting orders over engine noise. They sang songs nobody remembered learning. They shared bottles of wine liberated from French cellars weeks earlier. The alcohol burned warm against the January cold seeping through hangar walls. These celebrations were modest affairs. No grand ballrooms or orchestras. Just men gathering in mess halls with concrete floors and metal folding chairs. Someone had found an old phonograph. Someone else produced playing cards worn smooth from countless games. The mood was cautious optimism mixed with bone-deep fatigue. But while Allied personnel toasted survival and the promise of 1945, a very different scene was unfolding across Germany. In the pre-dawn darkness, hundreds of German pilots were already suiting up. No champagne here, no laughter echoing off hangar walls. Just cold metal, frozen breath clouds, and the terrible weight of desperation. This was Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's final gamble. A mission so audacious and desperate that it would either shatter Allied air power or destroy what remained of Germany's fighter force in one catastrophic morning. The answer would come with brutal clarity before noon on January 1st. This became known as the Hangover Raid, the morning when hungover Allied personnel stumbled from their bunks to find German fighters screaming overhead at treetop level. The day the Luftwaffe flew straight into its own destruction while trying to save itself. By late 1944, Germany was hemorrhaging from wounds that would not heal. The Soviet war machine ground westward with unstoppable momentum. Allied forces pushed eastward after breaking out from Normandy's killing fields. Between these two advancing armies, Germany was being slowly crushed. The once feared Luftwaffe had become a shadow haunting Europe's skies. Not because German factories had stopped producing aircraft. Surprisingly, German production lines were churning out fighters at record pace. Nearly 25,000 aircraft rolled from assembly plants in 1944 alone. Assembly workers labored around the clock. Raw materials flowed despite bombing raids. The machinery of war production still functioned. The crisis wasn't mechanical. It was human. Experienced German pilots were dying faster than training schools could replace them. Every dawn brought fresh casualties. Every mission consumed irreplaceable veterans who understood aerial combat's deadly mathematics. Their replacements were boys barely old enough to shave, thrown into cockpits with minimal training. These young pilots possessed enthusiasm but lacked survival instincts. They could keep aircraft level in good weather. They could execute basic maneuvers learned in training fields far from combat zones. But against battle-hardened Allied veterans who had survived hundreds of missions, these inexperienced pilots were lambs heading for slaughter. The skies above Germany had transformed into hunting grounds where Allied fighters prowled with predatory confidence. German aircraft became targets in their own airspace. Luftwaffe losses mounted with mathematical precision. Hundreds of pilots disappeared each week. Their aircraft fell like autumn leaves across German fields and forests. Then Hitler launched his Ardennes offensive. December 16, 1944. German armored divisions smashed through thinly defended American positions in Belgium's frozen forests. The goal was audacious. Split Allied forces down the middle. Capture Antwerp's vital port facilities. Force Britain and America into negotiating separate peace. The entire plan hinged on weather conditions. Winter storms had to keep Allied aircraft grounded. As long as fog and snow blanketed the Ardennes, German tanks could advance without facing the fighter bombers that had been devastating German columns since Normandy. And initially, weather cooperated perfectly. Thick clouds pressed down on Belgian forests. Snow swirled across frozen roads. Allied pilots sat in ready rooms, frustrated by conditions that made flying impossible. German armor pushed forward through the white wilderness, making shocking progress against surprised American units. But weather patterns change. The Luftwaffe High Command understood this basic meteorological fact. Once skies cleared, Allied air superiority would resume crushing German ground forces. The window of opportunity was measured in days, perhaps hours. They needed something dramatic, something that could neutralize Allied air power long enough for ground forces to reach their objectives. That desperation birthed Operation Bodenplatte, the name translated roughly as base plate in English, a reminder that pilots should fly low, right down on the deck where enemy radar couldn't track them effectively. The concept was brutal in its simplicity. Launch every available fighter against Allied airfields simultaneously. Hit them at dawn when aircraft sat lined up like targets in a shooting gallery. Destroy planes, fuel storage, hangars, anything supporting flight operations. Execute the attack across multiple bases at once, catching defenders completely unprepared. Planning responsibility fell to General Major Dietrich Peltz, a seasoned dive bomber pilot who understood ground attack tactics intimately. This assignment revealed German thinking. They weren't treating Bodenplatte as fighter operations. This was ground strike warfare, designed to eliminate enemy aircraft before they could become airborne. Peltz summoned commanders from fighter wings scattered across Germany. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as he outlined the audacious scheme. 17 airfields would face simultaneous assault. The attacking force would include over 1,000 aircraft drawn from every available fighter and ground attack unit along the Western Front. Messerschmitt Bf-109s would form the operation's backbone. These angular fighters had been Germany's primary air superiority weapon since war's beginning. Focke-Wulf Fw-190s would provide heavy firepower with their powerful radial engines and devastating armament. Even twin-engine Junkers Ju-88 night fighters would participate, serving as pathfinders, dropping navigation flares through the darkness. The target list read like Allied air power's directory in northwestern Europe. Eindhoven commanded strategic importance. Brussels served as a major hub. Metz anchored American operations. Antwerp, Asch, Evere, Maldegem, Ursel, Volkel represented every significant concentration of British and American aircraft within striking distance. Intelligence estimates suggested hundreds of Spitfires, Typhoons, Thunderbolts, and Mustangs occupied these bases. Successful raids could cripple Allied tactical air support for weeks, potentially allowing German ground forces to reach their Ardennes objectives. But absolute secrecy was mandatory. German commanders lived in constant fear of Allied intelligence capabilities. British codebreakers had been intercepting German communications for years, though German leadership never fully grasped the extent of this penetration. Security for Bodenplatte became obsessively tight. Pilots received briefings only hours before takeoff. Many believed they were flying reconnaissance missions until the final moment. Maps distributed to aircrew had identifying details deliberately removed. German airbase locations were scrubbed clean. Flight paths remained unmarked. The reasoning seemed logical. Captured pilots couldn't reveal information they never possessed. This paranoid secrecy would backfire catastrophically. Without proper navigation information, pilots struggled to locate targets. Some attacked completely wrong airfields. Others became hopelessly lost in unfamiliar territory. Even worse, German commanders failed to notify their own anti-aircraft batteries that hundreds of low-flying German aircraft would cross defended areas on January 1st morning. Nervous gunners manning flak positions around V-2 rocket sites and strategic installations operated under standing orders. Any low-altitude aircraft was automatically hostile. The consequences of this communication failure would prove devastating. Originally, Bodenplatte was scheduled for December 16th, coordinating with the Ardennes ground offensive. The concept was simultaneous air and ground attacks hitting Allied forces from multiple directions. But the same weather protecting German tanks also grounded German fighters. Day after day, pilots waited for clear skies. Day after day, fog and clouds kept aircraft earthbound. While they waited, the Luftwaffe continued bleeding precious resources. Between December 17th and 27th, German fighters flew whatever missions weather permitted, supporting ground operations. The price was horrific. Over 600 aircraft lost in 11 days. More than 300 pilots killed. The carefully assembled strike force Peltz had organized for Bodenplatte was being consumed before the operation could launch. Late December brought gradually clearing weather. Allied fighter bombers returned to European skies with vengeance, hammering German columns trapped on frozen roads. The ground offensive, which had achieved stunning initial success, began stalling as American reinforcements arrived and air support resumed devastating attacks. Bodenplatte's window was closing rapidly. Peltz faced an impossible decision: launch with depleted forces or watch the opportunity disappear entirely. December 30th brought favorable weather forecasts. Meteorologists predicted clear conditions for the following morning. This was the moment. Code signals flashed to fighter bases across northern Germany. Varus, the operation was authorized. Launch time. Dawn, approximately 9:20 local time, when sun angles would provide concealment while maintaining target visibility. That evening, while Allied personnel prepared New Year's celebrations, German pilots attempted sleep. Most found rest impossible. 19-year-old Unteroffizier Werner Molders later described arriving at his base to find aircraft arranged in moonlight like parade formations. 50 Focke-Wulf 190Ds gleaming under winter stars. The sight inspired and terrified simultaneously. Everyone understood this was a one-way mission for many participants. Ground crews labored through darkness, fueling and arming every flyable aircraft. Mechanics who had nursed battered fighters back to operational status for months now pushed themselves beyond exhaustion. Every plane had to fly. Every gun required loading. Every bomb and rocket needed preparation. There would be no second chances. Midnight celebrations on the Allied side presented stark contrast. Pilots and ground personnel gathered wherever warmth and companionship could be found. Officers' clubs, mess halls, maintenance hangars, anywhere offering shelter from January's bite. Someone discovered a phonograph player. Others produced bottles of wine and whiskey acquired through mysterious channels. These weren't elaborate parties, nothing resembling celebrations in London or Paris. But they represented genuine human moments. Men who had lived with constant danger for months allowed themselves brief hope. Maybe 1945 would finally bring war's end. At airfields near Eindhoven in the Netherlands, Canadian pilots from No. 438 Squadron raised glasses and sang off-key versions of half-remembered songs. At Asch, Belgium, American P-47 Thunderbolt pilots from the 365th Fighter Group traded combat stories and shared contraband liquor acquired from unknown sources. At Brussels, British officers toasted king and country while trying to forget that people were dying mere miles away in the Ardennes forests. Royal Air Force Sergeant Peter Crosswaite, an air controller stationed at Ursel, Belgium, later recalled the festivities. Nothing wild or excessive, but enough celebration to guarantee most personnel would report for duty, nursing substantial hangovers. Nobody anticipated trouble. The Luftwaffe had remained conspicuously absent from daylight operations for weeks. Allied pilots had grown accustomed to flying missions without encountering single German fighters. The assumption was fuel hoarding or simple resource exhaustion. Germany's Air Force appeared to lack capacity for major operations. Allied intelligence had detected suspicious activity. British signals intelligence, the famous Ultra Code Breakers, had intercepted unusual German fighter unit movements. Radio traffic suggested some kind of buildup, but analysts couldn't determine specific intentions or timing. Information was passed to field commanders, but got buried in constant intelligence report flow without specific threat details. Nobody at target airfields knew attack was imminent. As clocks struck midnight and men cheered the new year, German pilots were climbing into freezing cockpits 300 miles away. Engines coughed and roared to life in darkness. The sound was tremendous. Over 800 aircraft from dozens of bases starting simultaneously. Ground vibrated under engine noise. Exhaust flames illuminated winter night like torches. This represented the largest single operation the Luftwaffe had mounted in months. Junkers Ju-88 Pathfinders launched first. Twin engines strained as they climbed into winter darkness. Their mission was crucial: fly ahead of main formations and drop navigation flares along predetermined routes. Behind them, wave after wave of fighters followed. Messerschmitt Bf-109s displayed their distinctive angular profiles against starlit sky. Focke-Wulf FW-190 variants, both A and D models, represented powerful machines with radial engines capable of absorbing tremendous punishment while continuing to fly. Pilot experience varied dramatically. Some were veterans with dozens of combat missions. Many were teenagers on first or second operational flights, following formation leaders and praying they wouldn't become lost in hostile territory. Formations maintained extremely low altitude, sometimes only 150 feet above ground level. This served dual purposes: staying below Allied radar coverage while remaining difficult to spot visually in pre-dawn darkness. But flying tight formation at low altitude in darkness was extraordinarily dangerous. Strict radio silence was mandatory, so pilots followed exhaust flames of aircraft ahead, hoping nobody would make sudden movements. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and aircraft would collide catastrophically. Pathfinder aircraft dropped flares periodically, marking waypoints along attack routes. German pilots later described following these lights like breadcrumbs through enemy territory. But flares also attracted unwanted attention. Alert Allied radar operators noticed unusual activity patterns. Several reports were transmitted upward through command channels. However, in New Year celebration chaos and skeleton staffing, these warnings failed to reach appropriate personnel in time for defensive preparations. As German formations crossed into Allied-occupied territory, problems multiplied rapidly. The first disaster struck near The Hague, where V-2 rocket installations were protected by heavy anti-aircraft concentrations. These gunners had received no notification about Bodenplatte. When they observed hundreds of low-flying aircraft overhead, training took over. They opened fire immediately. German pilots suddenly found themselves flying through explosions created by their own forces. Black flak bursts filled air with deadly shrapnel fragments. Aircraft staggered and crashed. Some formations broke apart as pilots instinctively maneuvered to avoid friendly fire. Ju-88 pilot Unteroffizier Erich Hartmann later described barely avoiding German flak near the Igesel River while thinking the entire operation was already catastrophic failure. Most formations pressed forward, despite losses. Dawn was approaching steadily. Eastern horizon began showing first light traces. German pilots could begin distinguishing ground features below: villages, roads, rivers, railway lines. They were approaching target areas. At exactly 9:20 in the morning, just as Allied personnel began stirring and nursing celebration hangovers, hell descended simultaneously on 17 airfields across Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. At Eindhoven, pilots from Jadgeschwader 3rd roared in at treetop height. First warning came not from radar or observers, but from sound itself: deep, rolling thunder of massed engines. Ground crews looked up to see Focke-Wulf 190s flashing overhead so low that individual pilots were visible in cockpits. Then guns opened fire. 20mm cannons ripped into parked aircraft formations. Hawker Typhoons, the sturdy fighter bombers that had terrorized German ground forces for months, exploded as cannon shells found fuel tanks and bomb loads. Spitfires, iconic fighters of the Royal Air Force, were torn apart where they sat on hardstands. Rockets slung beneath German wings ignited and streaked in all directions, adding to the chaos and destruction. Fire crews scrambled to respond, but were immediately overwhelmed. Every few minutes, another 1,000-pound bomb detonated, sending shock waves across the entire airfield complex. Canadian pilot flying officer Bob Spur from No. 438 Squadron had just begun morning church service when the attack commenced. First shells struck the airfield, and suddenly everyone was diving for floor space, crawling between altar and organ for protection. They made it to an air raid shelter and huddled there as the world exploded outside. After the raid ended, Spur lit his pipe to calm shattered nerves. A delayed action bomb exploded directly outside the shelter. The concussion was so powerful, he bit clean through his pipe stem. At Metz in France, American pilots from the 365th Fighter Group watched in stunned disbelief as German fighters strafed rows of P-47 Thunderbolts. These were formidable aircraft, nicknamed Jugs for their massive radial engines and legendary ability to absorb damage and continue flying. But parked on ground, fully fueled and loaded with ammunition, they became death traps. Cannon fire touched off fuel tanks in brilliant orange fireballs. Ammunition cooked off, sending tracer rounds screaming in every direction. Pilots and ground crews ran for whatever cover they could find, as their own aircraft exploded around them in chain reactions of destruction. German pilots executing these attacks followed specific tactical patterns. Approach airfields at maximum speed and minimum altitude. Make multiple strafing runs in circular patterns. Hit everything appearing important: aircraft, fuel storage, maintenance facilities, control towers. Then escape before Allied fighters could respond effectively. Some pilots succeeded brilliantly. Others found themselves trapped in nightmarish situations beyond their training or experience. At Asch, Belgium, home to American fighter groups, the attack achieved complete tactical surprise. German fighters from Jagdgeschwader 11 swept across the field to find dozens of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts lined up in perfect target formations. For the first few minutes, it was exactly the turkey shoot planners had envisioned. Aircraft exploded in sequence. Fuel dumps erupted in towering columns of flame. Buildings caught fire and collapsed. But American defenders recovered quickly from initial shock. Anti-aircraft gunners who had been caught completely off guard found their weapons and began returning fire. 50 caliber machine guns opened up with devastating effect. Bofor's 40mm guns pumped shells into low-flying German aircraft. Most crucially, some American pilots managed to reach their aircraft and get airborne into the chaos. First Lieutenant Melvin Paisley was one of these quick-reacting pilots. He had been on alert status and reached his Thunderbolt just as first German aircraft appeared overhead. Taking off into sky full of enemy fighters required courage bordering on insanity, but Paisley never hesitated. He climbed straight into the attacking formation and began shooting. By engagement's end, he had destroyed 4 German aircraft in aerial combat. Other American pilots followed his courageous lead. Fighting over ash became vicious close-range combat, with aircraft twisting and turning barely above tree level. In total, Americans shot down 32 German planes over ash alone. The commander of the 365th Fighter Group, Colonel H. Norman Holt, later made a grim observation about the carnage. "We hope at least one of their pilots got back to tell the story. They'd think twice before trying it again." Similar scenes of destruction and desperate combat played out across the entire target list. At Brussels-Evere, one of Belgium's busiest military airfields, German fighters discovered hundreds of bombers and fighters arranged on parking areas. Lieutenant Günther Blummertz recalled the moment vividly. Aircraft standing in neat rows, then gun bursts smacking into formations. Spitfires attempting emergency takeoffs rolled over and burst into flames. It was chaos distilled into 15 minutes of concentrated violence. But not all German formations achieved success. Some attacked completely wrong airfields, wasting precious fuel and ammunition on targets holding minimal strategic value. Others discovered airfields that had been evacuated or relocated, attacking empty fields, while real targets sat untouched miles away. The obsessive secrecy that was supposed to protect the operation was now actively undermining it. Pilots with incomplete maps and inadequate navigation information were making fatal targeting mistakes that negated their sacrifice. And throughout the morning, German aircraft continued flying through their own anti-aircraft fire. Conservative estimates suggest that fully 1/4 of all German losses that day resulted from friendly fire incidents. Pilots who survived enemy guns were shot down by their own side's defensive batteries. A catastrophe emerged from deep-seated fear and broken chains of command. The bitter truth would reveal itself in the hours ahead. Operation Bodenplatte had shocked Allied forces completely. Enemy aircraft caught on the ground paid a heavy price. Yet what the Luftwaffe sacrificed would prove devastating beyond measure. German pilots wheeled toward home bases. Fuel needles dropped toward empty. Many understood they faced a race against time and physics. Allied fighters now filled the sky. They hunted the retreating German formations like wolves, pursuing wounded prey. The exhausted attackers had become targets themselves. Everything that happened next would decide the operation's legacy. Would history remember it as brilliant strategy? Or would it be recorded as the final suicidal act that obliterated Germany's last effective air force? Morning sun climbed higher over Belgium and the Netherlands on January 1, 1945. The sky had transformed into a combat arena unlike any seen in recent months. German pilots found their ammunition boxes empty. Fuel gauges showed needles creeping toward zero. Home seemed impossibly far away. The tables had turned completely now. Hunters had become the hunted in a deadly reversal of fortune. Allied pilots scrambled during the dawn attacks. Now they pursued with methodical determination. These weren't hungover amateurs stumbling through confusion. Battle-hardened veterans filled those cockpits. Men who had fought since the Normandy landings. Warriors who knew every combat trick ever devised. They understood air warfare at its most brutal level. Surprise had worked for the Germans on the ground. But aerial combat was different territory entirely. Here the Allies commanded every possible advantage. Their experience showed in every maneuver. Their confidence radiated through radio chatter. At St. Denis Westeremny, the story unfolded differently. Polish pilots from No. 131 Wing had been away. They were conducting a bombing mission when German fighters struck. Their home base burned in their absence. Returning pilots found devastation below them. 18 Spitfires lay destroyed among twisted metal and scattered debris. Columns of black smoke rose toward the morning sky. The acrid smell of burning fuel filled their cockpits. Combat pilots react instinctively to such sights. They attacked without hesitation or complex planning. Lieutenant Wacław Chodznacki had returned early. His bomb release mechanism had malfunctioned during the mission. Below him circled Focke-Wulf 190s. They moved in lazy patterns around his burning airfield. Chodznacki dove straight into them without backup or support. His guns found their target immediately. One German fighter exploded in brilliant orange flames. The burning wreckage plummeted downward. It crashed directly into a B-17 Flying Fortress, sitting motionless on the ground. But Chodznacki faced impossible odds alone. German fighters swarmed around his single Spitfire like angry wasps. Their combined firepower was overwhelming. Multiple guns tracked his every movement. His aircraft shuddered under repeated hits. Metal fragments flew from his wings. Engine smoke began trailing behind him. The Spitfire rolled over and dove toward the earth below. Chodznacki died in that crash. His sacrifice bought precious minutes for his squadron. Time for reinforcements to arrive from their bombing mission. Time for revenge to take shape. What followed became one of the war's largest low-level dogfights. Polish Spitfires engaged German Focke-Wulfs directly. Both sides flew on fumes. Fuel gauges showed critical levels across both formations. Aircraft twisted and turned barely above the treetops. Pilots pulled crushing G-forces in desperate maneuvers. Wings almost scraped the ground during tight turns. Tree branches whipped past canopies. The Polish pilots flew with consuming fury. Smoke still rose from their home base below. Friends had died in the surprise attack. Mechanics and ground crew lay dead among the wreckage. They fought with desperate, almost suicidal intensity. Every burst of gunfire carried personal vengeance. When the aerial battle finally ended, they claimed 14 German aircraft destroyed. 7 more Spitfires had been damaged severely. These force-landed due to battle damage or fuel exhaustion. But the Poles had extracted terrible revenge from their attackers. Of 36 Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 1 that attacked St. Denis Westeremny, 17 never returned home. Empty chairs at evening mess told the story. 17 pilots, missing or dead. Similar battles erupted across the entire region. The sky filled with individual combats. British Flight Lieutenant R.C. Smith flew his Spitfire over Eindhoven. He found himself confronting an entire German formation alone. 40 German fighters spread out before him. Any rational pilot would have turned away. Smith dove straight into their midst instead. His guns blazed as he carved through their formation. He shot down a Messerschmitt immediately. 9 others suffered damage from his attack. His ammunition boxes emptied before he could do more, but his aggressive assault scattered the entire formation. This kind of almost suicidal courage defined Allied fighter pilots in 1945. They believed the sky belonged to them. They fought like men defending their personal property. Fear seemed absent from their calculations. German formations, meanwhile, were falling apart completely. Unit cohesion had collapsed under pressure. Pilots scattered across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Each man flew alone now. Navigation became a desperate individual struggle. Maps deliberately lacked key landmarks and navigation aids. Security measures now worked against the pilots who needed guidance most. Some followed roads visible from the air. Others tried retracing their inbound routes from memory. Many became completely lost in unfamiliar territory. Fuel shortages made wrong turns potentially fatal. The attack plan had assumed simple strafing runs, quick attacks followed by immediate returns to base. But combat never follows neat planning assumptions. Reality proved far more complex and dangerous. Pilots had circled waiting for their attack opportunities. Others evaded heavy anti-aircraft fire through violent maneuvers. Some engaged Allied interceptors in prolonged dogfights. All these actions consumed precious fuel. Aircraft began dropping out of formations. Engines coughed and sputtered as fuel pumps sucked empty tanks. Pilots glided downward seeking emergency landing sites. Enemy territory stretched endlessly below them. Surviving crash landings meant facing capture by Allied forces. The casualty reports painted a grim picture. Numbers that told stories of systematic destruction. Jagdgeschwader 27 attacked Melsbrook airfield near Brussels. They started the morning with 43 aircraft. By afternoon, 18 pilots were missing or confirmed dead. Half their strength had vanished in a single operation. 17 pilots never returned to their home base. Some crashed in Belgium. Others were captured after bailouts. A few simply disappeared without trace. Empty bunks marked each absence. Jagdgeschwader 53 suffered even more devastating losses. They attacked Metz with 80 aircraft participating. 30 aircraft failed to return home, a loss rate approaching 50%. One entire group was intercepted by American fighters. This happened before they even reached their assigned target. 11 of 25 aircraft were shot down. They accomplished absolutely nothing. The raw numbers were staggering, but they failed to capture the full horror. These weren't just machines being destroyed. They represented irreplaceable human expertise and experience. Experienced pilots died in those cockpits. Formation leaders who understood tactics. Veterans who had survived years of aerial combat. Men the Luftwaffe simply could not replace. Among the casualties were 3 wing commanders. 5 group commanders died or went missing. 14 squadron leaders never returned to their units. The entire command structure was being systematically gutted. By noon, surviving German aircraft limped back to bases. They landed across Germany at whatever field they could reach. Pilots climbed from cockpits exhausted and shaken. Some carried wounds from combat. Ground crews who had worked through the night now assessed damage. Bullet holes punctured fuselages. Shrapnel had torn wings and control surfaces. Some aircraft were damaged beyond repair. Others landed at wrong airfields entirely. Fuel exhaustion forced emergency landings miles from home bases. The carefully planned operation had become chaotic and bloody. Organization had collapsed completely. At Luftwaffe High Command, officers tried assembling reports. Initial accounts from returning pilots suggested success. Airfields burning across Allied territory. Hangars exploding in spectacular fashion. Hermann Göring commanded the Luftwaffe with characteristic bombast. He presented the operation to Hitler as complete victory. Proof that German air power could still deliver decisive strikes. The claims were fraudulent from the beginning. They wouldn't survive careful scrutiny or detailed investigation. Reality would emerge in the coming days. The truth was far more sobering. Allied forces conducted their own damage assessments. The results were serious but manageable. Across 17 targeted airfields, approximately 300 aircraft had been destroyed outright. Another 200 suffered varying degrees of damage. Some sources suggested even higher numbers, possibly approaching 500 destroyed altogether. But record-keeping during chaotic attacks was necessarily imperfect. Exact figures would remain disputed. What was undeniably clear was significant German success. They had inflicted serious damage on Allied tactical air power. Multiple airfields were temporarily out of action. At Eindhoven, 26 Typhoons burned on the ground. 5 Spitfires were also destroyed completely. Another 30 Typhoons required extensive repairs before flying again. At Metz, 22 P-47 Thunderbolts were destroyed outright. 11 others suffered damage requiring workshop attention. The attackers had found their targets successfully. At Brussels, Ever, 34 aircraft were destroyed. 29 others sustained battle damage. At Melsbruck, 35 aircraft were destroyed. 9 others needed repairs. The destruction list continued across multiple airfields. For Luftwaffe commanders, these numbers looked genuinely impressive. They had disrupted Allied air operations significantly. Tactical air support was temporarily reduced, but here the narrative shifts dramatically. The Allies possessed something Germany had lost completely: the ability to replace losses quickly and efficiently. American factories produced thousands of fighters monthly. British production was nearly as robust and reliable. Within days, replacement aircraft were already arriving. They landed at the damaged airfields, still smoking from morning attacks. Ground crews worked around the clock repairing damage. Mechanics labored through shifts repairing aircraft. By January 8th, most affected units had returned to full operational strength. More importantly, Allied pilot casualties were minimal throughout. Most aircraft were destroyed while parked on the ground. Only a handful of pilots died in the attacks. 40 Allied personnel died during the morning attacks. This included 11 pilots and 29 ground crew. 145 others were wounded to varying degrees. These were tragic and meaningful losses, but in the context of ongoing air war, they were manageable. Pilots could be reassigned from other operational units. Training pipelines continued producing new aviators. The Germans suffered losses they could never recover from. The most reliable figures suggest 271 fighters destroyed. Another 89 were damaged beyond immediate repair. But aircraft losses were actually secondary concerns. The real catastrophe was human casualties. 213 German pilots were killed, missing, or captured. Another 21 were wounded. In a single morning, the Luftwaffe lost nearly as many pilots as typical weekly combat losses. These weren't inexperienced recruits fresh from training schools. Many were veteran officers carefully preserved for this operation. The kind of pilots who could lead formations effectively. Men who could train newcomers in combat techniques. Officers who understood tactics and possessed the combat sense necessary for survival. Germany had been suffering pilot shortages for months. Operation Bodenplatte made the situation exponentially worse. In the remaining 17 weeks of war, the Luftwaffe never recovered. Friendly fire casualties made everything even more tragic. Conservative estimates suggest 1/4 of German losses came from their own anti-aircraft guns. Pilots navigated through enemy fire successfully. They attacked their assigned targets as ordered. They were heading home when German gunners shot them down. Batteries that hadn't been informed about the operation opened fire. It was a completely avoidable disaster, born of excessive secrecy that defeated its own purpose. 22-year-old Alfred Mikkel of Jagdgeschwader 53 survived being shot down. He was captured by American forces shortly after. Photographs show him standing beside his wrecked Messerschmitt Bf-109. Soldiers from the U.S. 19th Infantry Division surround him. His expression captures Bodenplatte's reality better than any statistics. This was not victory by any measure. This was the end of effective German air power. Within days, the truth became impossible to hide. The Ardennes offensive, which Bodenplatte was supposed to support, continued collapsing. German forces retreated constantly. They were harried by the same Allied air power supposedly neutralized. On January 14th, Allied fighters shot down another 184 German aircraft. A single day's losses that exceeded most monthly totals. The Luftwaffe was being systematically destroyed. There was nothing left to stop the process. Hitler abandoned the offensive completely. He returned to Berlin as the grand vision crumbled. Splitting Allied forces had failed. Capturing Antwerp remained a fantasy. The Battle of the Bulge cost tens of thousands of German lives. It ended as an expensive, futile gesture. Operation Bodenplatte accelerated the Luftwaffe's destruction rather than preventing it. The Allies were initially shocked by the attack's audacity, but they quickly recognized it for what it represented. A desperate gamble that backfired spectacularly. Lieutenant General Karl Spaatz visited the damaged airfields. Major General Hoyt Vandenberg toured the destruction. Brigadier General Pete Quesada handed out medals and commendations. They praised ground crews who had fought fires. They honored pilots who had scrambled to fight back. They recognized that Germany had made a catastrophic strategic error. Allied forces named the operation the Hangover Raid. The name was both accurate and deeply ironic. Many Allied personnel were indeed suffering from New Year's celebrations when attacks began. But the real hangover belonged to Germany completely. The morning after Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe discovered it had spent its last reserves. Experienced pilots were gone forever. From the German perspective, the operation revealed desperate circumstances. They had scraped together over 1,000 aircraft for this single massive strike. They knew sustained operations were impossible. Fuel shortages made prolonged campaigns unthinkable. Pilot shortages meant every loss was irreplaceable. Constant Allied bombing of German industry reduced production to minimal levels. This was their one chance to change strategic circumstances. They had wagered everything on a single roll of the dice. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Colonel Johannes Steinhoff was a highly decorated German ace. He had achieved 176 confirmed victories. Later, he described the Luftwaffe's condition in those final months. They were assigning young pilots who were timid and inexperienced. Men who were genuinely scared but had to fly anyway. There was simply nobody else available. These young men were thrown into Operation Bodenplatte alongside remaining veterans. Many never came back from their first major operation. The learning curve was impossibly steep. 19-year-old Sergeant Werner Mauger had marveled at the sight. 50 Focke-Wulf 190s lined up in the moonlight before the mission. The spectacle was both beautiful and ominous. Mauger was one of the fortunate ones. He survived the operation and returned home. But he watched friends and squadron mates disappear, shot down over Belgium or captured after crash landings. For young pilots like Mauger, Bodenplatte was a brutal introduction. Modern air combat was unforgiving of inexperience. Numbers mattered most, and Germany no longer had them. The operation's aftermath revealed German intelligence failures. Many attacked airfields were not actually priority targets. Some held fewer aircraft than intelligence estimates suggested. Others had been partially evacuated already. Intelligence estimates suggesting hundreds of aircraft at each location were outdated or simply wrong. Planning was based on faulty information. Meanwhile, some of the most valuable Allied airfields escaped attack entirely. Strategic bomber bases and reconnaissance facilities were never targeted. German planners didn't know they existed. Reports indicated German formations attacking wrong airfields completely. Excessive secrecy meant pilots navigated with incomplete information. Some units hit targets of opportunity rather than assigned objectives. This chaos reduced overall operational effectiveness significantly. Even tactical success was less than it could have been. Planning failures multiplied throughout the operation. In following months, Bodenplatte's consequences became even clearer. Allied air forces continued operating without meaningful German opposition. Strategic bombing campaigns against German cities intensified. Fighter bombers ranged freely across Germany. They attacked trains, convoys, and retreating columns with complete impunity. The Luftwaffe still possessed aircraft, but lacked experienced pilots. By March 1945, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine River. They were advancing into Germany's heartland. Soviet forces closed in from the Eastern Front. The skies above Germany belonged entirely to the Allies. Bomber formations flew in daylight without fighter escorts. There was no longer any credible threat from German interceptors. The air war was effectively over. Operation Bodenplatte stands as dramatic strategic miscalculation. The basic concept was actually sound. Hit Allied air power when vulnerable. Destroy aircraft on the ground. Buy time for ground operations. But execution was fatally flawed from the beginning. Excessive secrecy prevented effective navigation. Friendly forces weren't properly informed. Pilots couldn't find their way home. Poor intelligence meant attacking wrong targets. Many airfields had already been evacuated. Most critically, the operation assumed destroying Allied aircraft would be decisive. It wasn't decisive at all. The Allies possessed logistics, production capacity, and trained pilots in reserve. They could absorb losses and recover quickly from setbacks. Germany was operating on the edge of complete collapse. Every pilot lost was genuinely irreplaceable. Every aircraft destroyed was one less defender against Allied advance. Bodenplatte spent Germany's last air power reserves. The temporary tactical victory had no strategic impact whatsoever. The sacrifice accomplished nothing meaningful. For men who flew the mission, it was tragedy wrapped in complete futility. They were brave, skilled aviators following orders. They served their country with dedication and courage. Many died believing they were striking a blow that would change the war's course. Instead, they flew into a meat grinder. It accomplished nothing except accelerating Germany's defeat. Allied pilots and ground crews who survived the attacks had their own perspectives. Many expressed grudging respect for the operation's audacity. Mounting such large-scale, coordinated attacks required genuine courage, but they also recognized the desperation behind it. Professional military observers could see Germany throwing away its last assets. It was a hopeless gamble with predictable results. Today, Operation Bodenplatte is remembered as the Luftwaffe's last major offensive action. It marked the end of German air power as strategic force. After January 1, 1945, the question was no longer whether Allies would win air superiority. It was simply how quickly Germany would collapse without meaningful air cover. The broader lesson extends beyond military tactics. It's a cautionary tale about desperation driving poor decisions, about excessive secrecy undermining operational effectiveness, about the critical difference between tactical success and strategic victory, and about human cost when leaders gamble with personnel lives pursuing probably unattainable goals. For Allied airmen who woke up hungover on January 1st, the experience was terrifying, but ultimately survivable. For German pilots who took off in darkness that morning, it was often a one-way trip. For the war's overall course, Operation Bodenplatte changed absolutely nothing. Allied advance continued relentlessly. Germany fell 17 weeks later. European skies, once contested by the world's finest pilots, belonged entirely to the victors. Operation Bodenplatte demonstrates fundamental truth about modern warfare. Audacity and surprise can achieve tactical results, but they cannot overcome strategic realities. Germany lacked resources, trained personnel, and industrial capacity. No single operation could change that underlying reality. The hangover raid succeeded in destroying Allied aircraft temporarily, but it cost Germany the irreplaceable core of its fighter force. It brought defeat one step closer, rather than preventing it. The men who fought that day deserve remembrance, not for the strategic futility of their operation, but for their courage under extraordinary circumstances. German pilots who flew into overwhelming opposition showed genuine bravery. Allied ground crews who fought fires and saved aircraft under attack demonstrated heroism. Fighter pilots who scrambled against impossible odds earned lasting respect. Many died with their lives spent serving nations locked in history's most destructive conflict. Operation Bodenplatte remains a stark reminder that boldest plans can backfire spectacularly. Desperation rarely makes for good strategy. The Luftwaffe waited for Allied forces to celebrate the new year, then launched an attack that destroyed itself. It was in the truest sense a self-inflicted wound. Germany never recovered from the losses. The hangover belonged entirely to the attackers.